dropping the gloves. Thanks for joining me here. I'm John Scott. Of course, I appreciate the support and the listens. We're going to have a good one today. You know, people have been inundating me with messages. I appreciate the support. I appreciate the effort to send me emails and messages and this and that and YouTube comments. I read them all. I try to respond to all of them. There are quite a few, so don't be offended if I don't respond. And I've been getting some good feedback. People saying, I enjoy this. I don't enjoy that. We miss Tim. We're glad Tim's gone. There's quite a few comments like that. So I'm sifting through them. I'm trying to adjust the show. What I have gotten a lot of positive feedback on is the deep dives. I've done a few to date, and I think overwhelmingly across the board, the people enjoy when I really focus in and hone in on one team instead of doing just a free for all and throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. So I'm going to continue to do that. And today we're going to, in honor of my former co-host, we're going to do the Boston Bruins. And, maybe this would have been hard if Tim was here because he's a very passionate fan and supporter of the Bruins, and it's hard to see through the blinds when you're that close to the chaos that is the Boston Bruins over the last 20-some years. But that's what we're going to get into. Another comment that I've gotten is people enjoy a little, personal talk. They want to know what's going on in my life, not to a crazy extent. We keep it short, succinct. So here we are. I'm going to give you a little update on my life. My house is done. I built it. It's fantastic. We've been living in it for the last month now. And as with all projects, things arise where you look back and you go, man, I wish I would have done that. And I had a big boner of a mess up where, and it might get a little complicated, but just stay with me. So I have a 250 amp wire running to my house, the power service to my house. I ran that to my panel. But I have two sub panels that run off of that main panel because it makes things easier for wiring and that sort of thing. I have a sub panel that goes to my boiler, and that just powers the boiler, the pumps, and everything that's boiler related. So if I want to work on that, I can just turn off the sub panel. I don't have to worry about getting electrocuted. Mind you, I've been electrocuted so many times in the last month and a half, either at my former house, because I'm trying to fix that up to rent it, or my current house, because I was trying to obviously do the electricity and that, electrical and that. No word of a lie, I've probably been zapped a dozen times in the last 5 months. Not terrible. Some of them worse than others where you connect to two poles and it knocks you off the ladder. Other times it's just a one pole and it's just a little zap, a little bee sting. All that aside, going back to the issue, I have a second sub panel on the other side of my house. I have a long house. I don't have a huge house, but it's a longer house. I think it's 100 some feet long. So I took one run of 50 amp wire to my sub panel, not thinking, by the way. I'm just like, okay, I'll have a sub panel over here, do that side of the house. I'll have my main panel here. That'll handle most of the things. As plans progress and as we're building the house and as I'm doing the wiring, I am running the majority of my appliances to my sub panel, not thinking, because I'm an idiot. And so we drywall, we get everything buttoned up, we start plugging things in. And I'm like, what the heck? Like, okay, what happened one day? Everything just breaks. The breaker for the sub panel just goes, it pops. I mean, that's weird. I don't think too much of it. And then it happens again. And I'm like, whoa, that's not good. And so I sit down and I actually think about things and I go, okay, I'm running all electric. I don't have natural gas. And so I'm running my dryer, my washer, my electric water heater, my induction stove, my dishwasher, my everything in the kitchen, and everything to do with laundry is running off of that one panel. And mind you, the stove is a 40 amp. The electric water heater is a 40 amp. The dryer is a 50 amp. The dishwasher is a certain amperage. Everything adds up. And the panel is only a 50 amp panel. And so one of those appliances on its own caps out that panel. And so I'm just like, well, okay, they're not all 40. Some are 30, some are 20. but it adds up pretty quick. So I have almost 100 amps going to that panel. I'm like, damn it. And so it's popped 2 or 3 times. And all you have to do, you go to the main breaker and you just reset the fuse. But still, it's an issue where the fridge as well. If it pops when you're not there, the fridge goes down. Or if it pops and you're in the middle of Christmas dinner and you're cooking a turkey and you don't realize it and the stove stops working and you're like, oh my gosh, like the turkey's not done. And so I have to fix that. And to do that, I'm just going to run another 50 amp line to that panel. And I'm going to take the existing 50 amp. No, I'm going to run a 100 amp line to that panel. And I'm going to take the existing 50 amp line that's there. I'm just going to connect it directly to my stove. So I should remove the stove and I'll have an upgraded service to that panel and all should be good. But again, to do this, I have to bury a wire from my initial main panel. We're going to go outside with it. So you have to do conduit and you have to do all this rigmarole where you're coming down and you got to bury it 18 inches and you got to come up and into the sub panel through the back of the panel. It's just a lot of work. And it's just a pain because I've already done it and you got to spend a couple more $1,000s to do this. So I don't know. It's just that's the update. Everything, the chickens, people care more about the chickens than they care about me. So the update on the chickens they're doing great. They're laying eggs. We're trying to buy more, but I just can't seem to find a supplier to supply me with started pullets. And a pullet is a female chicken that's of age, so to speak. And she's already laying or on the verge of laying. She's not a chick because it takes a lot of time for these little chicks to grow up to lay eggs. Typically, I want to say 10 months at the early age, and then a year, obviously, they're laying. But so I'm trying to find some pullets. So if you're in the northern Michigan area and you got some pullets you want to sell me, I'm in the market. And I'm not going to pay $35 for a chicken. I'm just saying that right now because I look around and it's like, oh, $35 for a Brazilian nut-breasted chicken. I'm like, I don't need the speckled Easter eggs. I just want some just plain eggs. I just want some egg layers. I don't need some fancy schmancy eggs. I just want my 6-egg omelet on Saturday and I want my 5 over easy on Sunday. That's all I want. So if you're in the area, I will buy those chickens from you. And I will be very happy to introduce them to my original chickens that are just doing fantastic. They're all laying 1 egg a day. The only issue is I'm trying to find a way to move my existing coop to my new house. I thought I could just throw some long forks on my buddy's tractor, but it didn't really work out that way. So now I'm kind of in a pickle where I got this big chicken coop and I don't know how to get it to my current house. My poor kid's got to walk a little bit further to get the eggs and give them water every day. Oh, my poor kids. They're so tortured. All right, that's the update. I'm by myself at my office. It's late at night. It's early in the morning. Having a whiskey. I'm having some fun. We're going to have some good interviews coming up. I've been talking to people in Slack. If you're not a member of my Patreon, I don't know what you're doing, but I've let them in on all the interviews we have lined up, and it's very exciting. Marty McSorley went over great gangbusters. I'm going to have him on again because we didn't really talk about fighting, but he's going to come on. We have some current stars that are going to come on. We have some former all-stars that are going to come on, some tough guys that are going to come on. It's very exciting. These guys are hard to nail down, but it'll be fun the next, I want to say 2 or 3 months for the show. So stay tuned. There's brighter things to come on the horizon. So here we go. We're going to get into the Boston Bruins. You know, how did we get here? Because this is a once storied franchise. You know, the original 6, one of the OGs who arguably, when you look at all the franchises in the NHL, they have their act together. They don't shuffle through presidents. They don't shuffle through GMs or coaches. They play the long game. And that seems to equal success for them. And it has equaled success. But based on where they were, you know, even 15 years ago, they won the Cup in 2011, to where they are now, there's a huge chasm and a huge leap from going from 2 years ago where we are the best team in NHL history in the regular season, where you're 23 points clear of the next closest team. That's 11 wins, by the way, better than the next closest team. And that's 2 years ago. To now, as it stands, last year, they were one of the worst teams in the NHL. 28th place in 32 teams. That drop off is hard to quantify. It doesn't happen. To go from the penthouse to the poorhouse in the blink of an eye, something must have happened. And when you look at this franchise, you have to go back to 2011. Before then, obviously, they were struggling, and it reached a climax in 2011 with the Stanley Cup winning. And when Connor Clifton was on the show a few weeks back, the one thing he kept emphasizing, he obviously had a terrible tenure with the Buffalo Sabres. He's now with the Pittsburgh Penguins. But he just kept hammering on the culture in Boston, how they went about their business, that everybody held this expectation to a high standard. And it started with the players, and it trickled down from management, and everybody bought in, and everybody understood the common goal that we had, which was to win. It wasn't to make money. It wasn't to score points. It wasn't to get accolades from the NHL. It was to win, because I think they all understand, and good teams understand this after a while. When you win Stanley Cups, playoff rounds, you will find those other things eventually. And that's why it happens after every Stanley Cup champion. You win the Stanley Cup, and all the other GMs in the league look at that team and they go, ooh, I want that guy. He won a Stanley Cup. What does he have that I don't? He is a champion. He has those intangibles. So the Boston Bruins, pretty early on, at the end of the 2000s, the first decade, they understood what that culture would lead to. And they obviously got that, because they all made a ton of money. They all won awards. And all those accolades came with instilling the culture early on. And in 2008, 9, 10, 11, they built the building blocks for what we saw in all of 2000s. And it started with hard play, disciplined play, energetic play. They had a good mix of young kids and veterans. When you look at that 2011 team, there were no superstars. I know some of them progressed into being superstars, but they were a mix of young kids, skilled veterans. Tyler Seguin, that was his first season. Milan Lucic was 22. Brad Marchand, David Krejci, all really skilled players, some of whom would go on to be superstars. Still, maybe currently are superstars when we look at Brad Marchand in the latest Stanley Cup run with the Florida Panthers. But then you had the veterans. Mark Recchi, 43. Andrew Ferentz, 31. Zdeno Chara, Shane Knighty, Thomas Caberlet. All guys who have been around the block. They knew how to play the game. They have been on good teams. They've been on bad teams. When you get a mix of solid vets who get it, and you add that to good young players who are willing to learn and willing to take advice from these older guys, it's a great recipe for success. And you see all these teams that have young players, whether it's the Chicago Blackhawks, the San Jose Sharks, the Ottawa Senators, all these young teams, the Montreal Canadiens. The one thing that the GMs try to do, and everybody knows they're doing it, is you surround them with good vets who can instill good tendencies, who could be good role models for these young players, whether it's a Tyler Toffoli, a Nick Foligno, those types of players who you bring in, and hopefully their experience, their work ethic rubs off on the young guys. I know when I came into the league, I walked into the locker room, there was Owen Nolan. There was Mikko Koivu. There was Nick Schultz. Older guys who I looked at and I went, oh, okay, yeah, that's how you do it. That's how you have a 20-year career in the NHL. Maybe Owen Nolan wasn't the prime example because the guy never stretched at all and barely lifted weights. He was just strictly a pure skilled hockey player who did it the old school way. But Nick Schultz worked his ass off every single day. Guys like that who weren't overly talented, but just willed it, and they worked at it. And that's what the Bruins did. They brought these guys in. Recchi was an incredible talent, but at that time he was 43 years old. He worked his tail off. Andrew Ferentz, the same thing. Zdeno Chara, the same thing. Shane Knighty, I played with him. The guy was a beast in the locker room. They had no egos whatsoever. They were all happy for each other. And their top scorer, by the way, 62 points. 62 points in 80 games. Their top scorer had Milan Lucic, just 22-year-old kid. Do you think the high-end guys cared who were making the bunch of money? No. Why? Because they were winning games. And they understood what it took to win. And they didn't care if they got their cookies. They just wanted to win. Oh, by the way, that culture that they instilled, they also beat the hell out of other teams. Milan Lucic had 121 penalty minutes and led the team with 62 points. They built that big bad Bruins reputation, and they loved it. They would go in, they would outscore you, and they would beat you up. I remember going into the Garden. I gotta take a little nip of my Crown Royal. Just let me have a little taste. I remember going into the Garden. It was, who are we going to fight tonight? Are we going to get ran through the walls? It was Lucic. It was Nathan Horton, my teammate from the Thorold Blackhawks. People forget how physical he was. It was Gregory Campbell. It was obviously Sean Thornton, Adam McQuaid, Zdeno Chara, all willing to fight, all willing to bury you through the boards. You never got a night off when you went into Boston. You knew what kind of game you were getting. And conversely, when they went into your barn, they tried to do the same thing. They tried to bury you through your own boards. That was the Boston Bruins. So they go through the season in 2011. I don't want to spend too much time on this one team because it gets a little long. We're already 16 minutes into this podcast, and I haven't gotten into 2012 yet. But they have an incredible season. They don't, win the President's Trophy by any means. I think they came 7th or 8th in the league, and they beat Vancouver in Game 7 to win the Cup. And everybody's happy. They were built for the playoffs. This wasn't a regular season team. This was a playoff team. They were balanced in scoring. All 4 lines scored. They were 5th in the league in scoring. When you look at a roster that doesn't have a superstar, that doesn't have a guy even close to a point per game, you go, wait a minute, how the heck did they finish 5th in the league in scoring? It's because they were balanced. All 4 lines scored. I remember lining up versus their 4th line. It was Dan Paille, it was Sean Thornton, and it was Gregory Campbell. And they were just as dangerous as their first line. It was amazing how balanced that team was. But as good as they were scoring, 5th in the league, they were stingy defensively. You had Tim Thomas. You had that defensive core that was just incredible, whether it was Wyden or Seidenberg or Chara or Ferentz or Johnny Boychuk or McQuaid. It was an incredible defense that didn't have, like we see today, the incredible puck-moving defenseman. They have it now in McAvoy. They had it in Torrey Krug, but when they won in 2011, it was just a great group of defensemen who played the right way. No one made mistakes. No one played out of their pocket, and they were really, really good. And that's the culture. They win. They play hard. They don't care how they win, whether it's 1-0 or whether it's 7-5. They just play to win the game. They were relentless, and they were exhausting to play against. There was a few teams in that era who I enjoyed playing against them, but I know the higher end guys didn't enjoy playing because you knew when you got the puck, you were being pasted through the boards. It was the Bruins, the St. Louis Blues, and the LA Kings. All 3 of those teams were just relentless in their attack, in their defense, in their forecheck. It was hard to play against those teams. Some people relish playing against those teams. Other people shied away where you get the flu and you just, I don't want to touch the puck. I don't want to go in the corner. I don't want to go into the physical areas. And you become spectators at that point. It's just because it's a hard game. It's a man's game. And that's the culture that the Boston Bruins built. But over the next 12 years, slowly but surely, that culture eroded. Whether it was players leaving, you win a Stanley Cup, you want more money, and you leave. Having to pay players to keep them, to big contracts, management changes. Those all things were a part of what we see today with the Boston Bruins, where it's a huge question mark. All right, Peter Chiarelli takes a lot of flack. I was not a huge fan of him. Obviously, he did great in Boston, goes to Edmonton, ruined the Edmonton Oilers, and just it's really, really good. He did a very masterful job with this Boston Bruins roster. He took over a team that was terrible 3 years prior and rebuilt them in 3 years and had them second place in the league and primed for long-term success. And when he got there, mindful the roster had some talent on the roster. They had Kessel, they had Chara, they had Bergeron, so they had pieces when he arrived that you could build around. So this wasn't just the cupboards were bare when he got there. as most bad teams, you do get high draft picks, and then the GM eventually gets fired, and then a new GM comes in, and it's like, okay, I got something to work with. But what Peter Chiarelli did was he didn't, he wasn't resigned to just regular season success. I think he saw a team that was good, and he added some good players, but wasn't going to win the Stanley Cup. And my age old adage is, what are we doing this for? Are we doing this just to keep our job? Are we doing this just to make the playoffs? Or are we doing this to win the Stanley Cup? And you have to applaud Peter Chiarelli from when he took over the Bruins in 2006, because mind you, he was only the 8th GM in Boston Bruins history. They've had 9 GMs now. They've been a franchise for over 100 years, and they've had 9 GMs. That's incredible. When you look at other teams, I think I had 9 GMs when I was with the Sabres for 2 years. So the Bruins give their GMs some runway to build, and I think Chiarelli knew that. So in 2006, he starts to rebuild. He starts drafting, and this is the one knock on Peter Chiarelli. He is a terrible management of draft picks. All of his picks are terrible for the most part. He just can't do it for whatever reason. He has one notable pick in his tenure with the Boston Bruins. That was Tyler Seguin. That's it. Of his whole, I think he was there for 9 years. That's the only pick where I look back and I go, oh, and I guess Dougie Hamilton. But we'll get to that. Those picks weren't even his. He was gifted those picks because of one of the trades he made. But let's get into the trades, because that's where he really shined, I feel like, where he took this roster that was good in 2008, 2009, 2010. They were a good team. They were making the playoffs. They were consistently in the top 5 to 7 of the NHL at this time. But he wanted to win a Stanley Cup. And he made some tough decisions, and he had some foresight. Getting Andrew Ference and Chuck Kobasu, that was his first trade for Wayne Primo and Brad Stewart, the two big pieces when they got Joe Thornton. Traded them away and got Andrew Ference, big piece of that Stanley Cup team. Getting Aaron Ward for Paul Mara. Aaron Ward, tertiary piece, but a good solid defenseman. Dennis Weidman for Brad Boyes. Brad Boyes was a good forward. Getting Dennis Weidman, then using him and flipping him for a big piece when we'll get to that later. Adam McQuaid for a 5th rounder. Seeing talent where a team really doesn't see it. Adam McQuaid, obviously, part of their Stanley Cup run. A huge piece. Good young defenseman. Maybe underrated. Shane Knighty for Brandon Buczynski. Getting that veteran piece in to just calm things down on the back end. A good 5'6" defenseman. Johnny Boychuk for Matt Hendricks. Matt Hendricks, a good 3rd or 4th line centerman. Great on the penalty kill. Great on the faceoff dot. A hard piece to let go. A player that fits in well with the Boston Bruins culture. But knowing the need for a physical defenseman on the back end who has a cannon of a shot and seeing value where other teams don't see value. Great pickup by Johnny Boychuk. And getting Mark Recchi, a veteran who knows how to play the right way, who doesn't expect things, who comes in and can just mentor the young kids, can maybe shine when he's put in certain situations, but just knows when to back off when he's not the guy. A great pick. And then, of course, the big trade. 3 years, making the playoffs. I think Peter Chiarelli took a long look at this roster and he said, we need to make a seismic change. And the big trade was Phil Kessel to the Toronto Maple Leafs. At this time, Phil Kessel was just coming into his own. He was a everybody knows Phil Kessel. An incredibly skilled goal scorer. That's it. He is a legitimate bona fide sniper. He can burn when he's going. He's got a cannon for a shot. He's got just a laser-locked skill. But there's the other side of the coin. Not too motivated. Obviously not a champion in the weight room. And just doesn't, maybe in Peter Chiarelli's eyes, have that killer instinct when it comes in the playoffs. When he traded him, he was a 21-year-old kid. Had just scored 36 goals in the NHL. It's hard to score goals in the NHL. This guy put up 36 as a 21-year-old. Those types of players you want to keep. Peter Chiarelli looked at this roster. He looked at what they had done in the last few years, and he made the very, very, very difficult decision. And what compounded this decision, he traded them to an interdivision rival, another Original Six team, who the Bruins battle year in and year out to the Toronto Maple Leafs. He gets 2 first-rounders and a 2nd-rounder. Going back to Tyler Seguin, one of those picks that they got ended up being Tyler Seguin, 2nd overall. The other pick that they got ended up being Dougie Hamilton. They make this trade, And 2 years later, they win the cup. This is like a huge win for the Boston Bruins. We obviously know they have the huge losses with the Joe Thornton trade. This is a massive seismic trade that I don't think Peter Chiarelli gets enough accolades for. Trading this guy for 2 first rounders and a second, a huge gamble for this team who was good at that time, a dangerous team. And then they win the cup 2 years later. This is the definition of addition by subtraction. This is what the Florida Panthers did 4 years ago when they traded Jonathan Huberdeau to the Calgary Flames. Huberdeau coming off a 15-point season. Crazy trade. Then they win the cup, and now they're back-to-back champs. Other trades he made, getting Dan Paille for a third, Dennis Seidenberg, bringing in Nathan Horton, Gregory Campbell, for Dennis Wideman and a first. Huge trade. Chris Kelly for a second, a good vet who can do the hard things, who can play up and down the lineup. Thomas Caberlet for a first and second when they're really going for the cup. All of these trades, all the guys they bring in, they were notable contributors to that 2011 Cup. They built the groundwork of what we saw for the next 10 years, trading away stars that didn't fit within the culture. After they win the Cup, trading Blake Wheeler, trading Dennis Wideman, trading Sagan eventually. This laid the groundwork for the team that we saw for the next 10 years. They made the Cup final again in 2013. Lost to the Chicago Blackhawks in 6 games. They still use that same recipe in 2013 that they had in 2011. Good young players, great vets, no egos. There was a lockout shortened season, only played 48 games. You would think a team that won the Stanley Cup in 2011, made it in 2013, would have like a superstar on their roster. The Blackhawks were full of superstars. The Boston Bruins leading scorer of that year, Brad Marchand, 36 points in 45 games. That was their MO. That was their modus operandi. Everybody was pulling on the rope. Nobody was pushed out ahead as the guy, the superstar, the one who gets all the points, and nobody cared. They won games. They scored whenever they wanted to. They punched you through the boards. They were tough. They did whatever they wanted. They were stout defensively. That was the Boston Bruins. Every franchise wanted to be them. There's a reason the Boston area was the hotbed for championships. The Bruins were doing what they needed to do. They were a part of that MO. They were hardworking, blue-collar guys. And vets wanted to play there. They got Jaromir Jagr, they got Jerome McGinley, Simone Gagne, Mark Recchi, and there's more. Rick Nash. The list goes on and on. Guys wanted to play there. But then things changed. The losses piled up. The years started to move on. They weren't making the Stanley Cup Finals. It got into 2015 and 16 and 17. Finally, Chiarelli was fired in 2015. Claude Julien was fired the next season. Then you can see the shift. You can see the shift in culture. It went from everybody's pulling on the rope. Everybody's trying to win. We're a tough, hard-nosed team. We're hard to play against. You don't want to come into our barn. And then it shifted into superstars. It shifted into we're going to be a run and gun team. It shifted into it's me, 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 me. I want mine. The GM, the coach. It was not the same culture that was built in 2007, 8, 9. Bruce Cassidy was brought in as coach. Don Sweeney was hired as a GM. And early on, Don Sweeney, I think, did some great work. You know, by the time he was instilled as GM in 2016, the prospects cupboard was pretty bare. And that happens when you're making Stanley Cups and you're trying to compete. They had drafted horribly, as I mentioned. They had, 4 draft picks that were of note? Maybe. Only Dougie Hamilton and Tyler Seguin were really, really solid, impactful NHL players. And Peter Chiarelli's whole 9-year tenure. That's insane. So Don Sweeney had to make some changes. And much like Peter Chiarelli when he traded Phil Kessel, he made a big splash when he first came in. He trades Dougie Hamilton to Calgary Flames in exchange for a first and second rounder and a couple other picks. He trades young goalie Martin Jones for a first rounder. He trades away some, fan favorites, Mark Savard and Riley Smith for Hayes and gets some cap relief. Now, in his tenure, we mentioned draft picks. I need to note how bad they had drafted when Peter Chiarelli was there. Obviously, Sagan Hamilton were the two big stars. The only other meaningful NHL players that were drafted under their tenure. I would say Matt Grzelcyk, Pasta, and Danton Heinen, Jake DeBrusk, and Brandon Carlo. That's 5 other players. And keep in mind, this is over almost 10 years. And the top 2 guys came from the Leafs trade with Phil Kessel. He had swing and a miss first round misses all the time. Zach Hamill at 8, Joe Colburn at 16, Jordan Caron at 23, Malcolm Subban at 24. In the infamous draft, it was 2014 where they had the 13th, 14th, and 15th overall pick and took Jakob Zoberl, Jake DeBrusk, and Zachary Sinchen. It's awful, awful, awful. And so you think it can't get any worse. Well, Don Sweeney makes those trades. You get a couple firsts with the Martin Jones and Dougie Hamilton trades. You get some cap relief. Don Sweeney has not fared any better in the draft game than Peter Chiarelli did. You know, he hit the jackpot with Charlie McAvoy as his first pick in 2016 at pick 14. That one was great. And then the next year he nabs Trent Frederick and Ryan Lindgren. No, that was the same year. So that was a great draft for him, his first draft. After that, like literally nothing since 2016 as far as good quality NHL players coming in from Don Sweeney in the draft. I don't know if it's the scouts, I don't know if it's the GM, but something in Boston prevents them from drafting impactful players. It just doesn't happen. But because of those trades, because of shifting cap away and drafting Charlie McAvoy, that works, they get back into the playoffs. But you could see a drastic change in style. Whether it was Bruce Cassidy, whether it was Don Sweeney, this wasn't a dump it in, pound you through the boards type team. It was a more contemporary style of play. It was more free flowing. Brad Marchand was utilizing his offense. You had David Pastrnak, getting more points. The leaders on the team were still there. It was Krejci, Bergeron, Chara. They were still there. But I think they took a back seat to Marchand and Pasta and Torrey Krug. Those 3 guys were now the leaders on this team. Were they a better team? Maybe. Were they more fun to watch? Yeah, they scored a lot. Like, they were a very entertaining team, but that did not translate into success in the playoffs. So they were good. They were a very good team. And they continued to get better from 2016 to 2017 to 2018. This was a good team. And Don Sweeney knew this. And so he started to add pieces. He started to try to ramp up for their big playoff push. And they hit their peak in 2019. They made the Stanley Cup Finals. That was the peak. But again, they lose to St. Louis, unfortunately. But then you think, okay, well, we're going to continue this. And they did. It's amazing. The previous Cup-winning team had a mix of youth and vets. This team did too, but they weren't as focused on defense as years past. They had, good vets in David Backes. They had Tuukka Rask and Yaroslav Halak in net, but they didn't have the depth. You have those superstars, and Marchand's getting a point per game, and Pasta's getting 40-plus goals. You don't have the depth when you have those high-end guys. You rely so heavily on the top 2 lines like this second edition of the Boston Bruins did. And instead of having the solid third and fourth lines with the Campbells and the Thorntons and the Paille, and even Luch is playing on the third line, and Michael Ryder, you replace them with, a Heinonen, a Chiarelli, a Wagner, a Chari, a Backes. It's not the same. A DeBrusk. It's not the same. And not that you have to be the same team year after year after year to win the Stanley Cup. And you have to adapt. I get that. But for comparison's sake, when you have one team that not one player hits 70 points, not one, and you have a whole group of guys getting 50, 50, 60, 60 points, and you win the Stanley Cup, and you have a super deep roster, and you have a great core defenseman, and you have a good goaltender, and you compare that to the team that made the Stanley Cup final in 2019, where you have 2 to 3 superstars, and you have a different mentality of playing. You're still really good, but you don't win. But you're still successful. It's hard to admit that maybe the team that's deeper is a better team, because when you make the Stanley Cup, you think, oh gosh, this is a great team. But you only have to look at the last 2 years to understand that maybe depth is an asset. Maybe having the best players on the planet doesn't translate into a Stanley Cup win. The Florida Panthers are a hell of a team. Hell of a team. But I don't think anybody watching the playoffs would be confused when you say, who are the best players on the ice right now? It's Draisaitl, it's McDavid, and it's Evan Bouchard. Bouchard was the best defenseman, and Draisaitl and McDavid were the two best forwards. Hands down. Hands down. When you look at the numbers, when you look at the vision test, every single game, those guys were incredible. But it takes more than three guys to win a Stanley Cup. And you have to play four lines, or you don't win. And the last 2 years are just more evidence to that. The Florida Panthers have two Stanley Cups and the Edmonton Oilers have none. The Boston Bruins did not win in 2019 and they won in 2011. Deep teams win Stanley Cups, not superstars. It's a luxury to have a superstar. Don't get me wrong. Superstars have won Stanley Cups, but even going back, talk to Marty McSorley, when Wayne Gretzky was winning Stanley Cups and Mark Messier, the depth that they had was incredible. Because Wayne obviously was putting up points. The third and fourth line were putting up points too. They were just as valuable as Wayne and Messier and Curry and Anderson. There was other guys who were really, really solid players. So, you lose the Stanley Cup final in 2019. They still want to win. They still are consistent contenders. They're constantly adding at the deadline, trading assets for their pursuit of the cup, trying to milk the last few drops out of their fantastic core of Chara and Bergeron and Krejci and Marchand and McAvoy now and Krug and all these great players. Were trying to win the Stanley Cup. When they did own their first-round draft picks, they still struck out massively. They drafted John Beecher in 2019, Fabian Lysell in 2021. They traded their 2020 pick for Andre Cachet, and they traded their 2022 pick for Hampus Lindholm. So they were all in. That brings us to 22-23. Obviously, we had Connor Clifton on. He talked about that season. Nothing could go wrong. We had Jeremy Swayman on. Incredible season. Everything was going right. They were first in goals against, second in goals for. Everything they threw at the net went in. Everything they had thrown at their net, they saved. The stupid hugs that the goalies were making. Everybody was having a good time. Nobody got injured. It was surreal. They were winning every one-goal game they had. They had no adversities at all. They were playing for Bergeron. He might retire. Everything's going great. They come to the trade deadline. They win the trade deadline, for Pete's sake. Don Sweeney goes out and just nails it. He brings in Dmitry Orlov, a great defenseman who's solid, who can kill penalties, who can throw him on the power play. He hits. You bring in Garrett Hathaway, just a solid fourth-line checker who can score. Fantastic. You bring in Tyler Bertuzzi, who can play on the first, second, third line, who's what it means to be a Bruins player. In your face, he hits. He does everything. He doesn't back down. Fantastic. To get those guys, you trade away 2 firsts and a bunch of seconds and thirds. So you're going all in this season. That's it. The greatest regular season team of all time, mortgaging their future at the trade deadline to even make their team even better. They probably didn't have to make any moves, but they still went all in and added 3 solid players to this already imposing roster. And what happens? Take a little sip here. What happens? You go up 3-1. Then you lose the next 3 games. And you're out of the playoffs. And that's it. And then underneath all of it, you could see it. And we called it. I thought it would happen the next year. But you could sense the cracks. Even before the season. When you look back, you could see the signs. Because of all the constant contending for the last decade and a half, there was no good young prospects. None. None at all. And those that they did like when they did come up were not that good. The core was aging. Bergeron was 37. Krejci was 36. Marchand, who had played a ton of playoff games, was 34. Chara was $1.5 million. They were getting old. They were starting to pay their players. When you look back at when they were winning, I think the highest contract guy was $7 million. And that was David Krejci. Compare that to teams they were playing against, the Toronto Maple Leafs. They already had $10 million guys. You know, Matthews was making 10. Tavares was making 10. They were ahead of the game when it comes to taking less to get more. But now, You can't do that. So they were paying McAvoy 9.5. Pasta was making 11.25. Allmark was making 5. Coyle 5.25. Lindholm 6.5. DeBrusk, for Pete's sake, was making 4. It's too much. It's too much for what you're getting. I think McAvoy and Pasta earned that. They deserve that. Allmark, of course, great goaltender, but you had Swayman in the wings. Overpaid for guys like Coyle. I think Lindholm makes too much. DeBrusk makes too much. It needed to change. And that changed in 2024-25. Jim Montgomery got fired, who won Coach of the Year 2 years prior. President's Trophy. They started to trade everybody they could. Get rid of everybody. Taylor Hall, Nick Foligno, Linus Ullmark, Trent Frederick, Brandon Carlo, Brad Marchand, Charlie Coyle. Trade them all. We need to regroup. We are in a bad spot. We have no prospects. We have no cap space. We have no future. You guys are old. We need to move on. Trading those guys, they free up $32 million in cap space. You bring in some good young prospects. Casey Middlestead, you get 3 firsts. Great job, Don Sweeney. Fantastic job. I applauded him on the show last year. I thought it was a masterful job. As much as he had botched the previous 5 years with bad contracts and maybe mortgaging the future when he didn't have to, bad trades at certain times, bad negotiations with players, he did the right thing to trade those guys. He saw the writing on the wall. They needed to move on. They needed to rebuild. They needed to reset this team. And this was a good start. Use those first-round picks for draft picks. Use that extra money, maybe on your young players. Go through a couple, lean years. You still have good pieces to build around. Take a couple years off. That's not what Don Sweeney did, though. Did he? That's not what he did. What did he do with that extra money that he had? That extra money that he saved from a Taylor Hall or a Nick Foligno or an Allmark or a Frederick, Carlo, Marchand, Coyle. Did he just hold off and wait? No, he goes out and signs terrible contracts. He goes out and just ruins this team for the next 5 years, doesn't he? Doesn't he? He signs friends of the show, Nikita Zadorov. 6 years, $5 million. Had a great playoffs, Nikita. Don't get me wrong, with the Vancouver Canucks. Good player, $30 million. He signs Elias Lindholm, 7 years, 7.75. Is he your second-line centerman that you want? Is he the guy? I hope so. Signs Jeremy Swayman, 8 years, 8.25 for $66 million. He had a hell of a run in the playoffs. He played great when he was on the ice. Not so good this year. Obviously traded Linus Ullmark. Brings in Jonas Korpisalo in that trade. What the hell are we doing when you make that trade? Linus Ullmark is coming off a Vezina Trophy win. And you trade him and you bring in a goaltender who has 4 years at $3 million per on his contract, who was just atrocious the year before. Awful trade. Awful trade. He signs Tanner Jeannot, 5 years, 3.4 for $17 million. What? Terrible. Tanner Jeannot wins the Stanley Cup, and all of a sudden he's walking on water. You're going to give him $3.4 million? That's crazy. Oh, I don't even think he won a Stanley Cup. There's the one nugget where I get wrong. You guys can hammer me on that. And then he re-signs Casey Middlestead, 3 years, 5.75. I don't mind that, but still. You exchange Carlo Marchand, Coyle, Allmark, Frederick for these guys. For Lindholm and Zadorov and Swayman and Korpisalo and Jeannot and Middlestead. In my eyes, that's a downgrade. And you're paying them more money. And they have longer term. So you swap out champions who are a little bit older for younger guys who are not champions who make more money. How does that make sense? They had an opportunity to retool, to do a quick rebuild, to maybe struggle for a year or two, get a high draft pick, trade some guys at the deadline, get some more assets. But instead of doing that, they just jumped right into the free agent pool, which wasn't a strong free agent class. And you come out with this crap. And now they're done. They're resigned for failure for the next 5 years. And not the type of failure where you get good draft picks and you're able to rebuild this team to get good, young, impactful players. You are in the worst possible spot that you want to be. you're going to be middle of the road. You might contend for the playoffs one year, and then the next year you're out of the playoffs, and then you surprise some people and you're in the playoffs the next year. That's it. And don't look now. This next year has a loaded free agent class. There's so many star UFAs that are going to be hitting the open market, led by Connor McDavid potentially. And you are slated with the salary cap rising, by the way, to $105 million, I think. It's $95 this year, so you're getting another $10 million on top of that next year. You are slated to have a whopping $20 million to spend. Whoa, $20 million. And that's not before you have to re-sign an Andrew Peeke, who I really like, a Matthew Portraz, and John Beecher. 3 young players who are okay, but you want to re-sign them, especially Andrew Peeke. I really like him. So you're gonna spend maybe $10 million there. So you have $10 million to spend. Great. That's gonna nab you some great players, Don Sweeney. So at the end of the day, the Boston Bruins went from, a struggling up and coming team in 2008-9 to a Stanley Cup champion that built this culture that other GMs and teams die to have. And it was because of the players they brought in, the GM and the management that they had, the Charas, the Bergeron, the Krejcis. Those guys built that culture. And then fast forward to now where you have a chance to maybe build another culture. You have guys there who knew what it takes. You still have solid pieces. And instead of doing the right things, Don Sweeney just takes a huge pile of steaming crap on this franchise and signs bad players because maybe he doesn't want to lose his job. And he does, we got to contend. And he signs all these contracts. And now the Bruins went from the penthouse and just being a model franchise, great for 10, 12 years, and they have a chance to sustain that franchise, to sustain that reputation. And instead, Don Sweeney and Cam Neely have dragged them down. And mark my word, it's 2025 now. This team will not even be in contention until 2032. At the very earliest. I don't see any world where they contend for a cup at all in the next 5 to 6 years. And it's because of what Don Sweeney did in the last 2 years. That's it. And he still has a job. And he just got re-upped. It's a crazy world, everybody. It's a crazy world. But on that, I will bid you adieu. I appreciate the support. And pray for the Boston Bruins because they need it. And I will see you all next week. Have a great weekend. And cheers.
Thank you for listening.